In the final months of World War II, as the island of Okinawa fell into chaos, a hidden chorus of voices emerged from the rubble. These were not soldiers or generals, but farmers, mothers, schoolchildren, trapped inside the deadliest battle ever fought on Japanese soil. Their whispers, confessions, and final letters reveal a truth far darker than Tokyo ever allowed: the terror of a civilian population abandoned, indoctrinated, and suddenly face to face with an enemy they were taught to fear. This is what they said when Okinawa collapsed. In the early months of 1945, Okinawa stood suspended between two worlds: a subtropical island of fishing villages and terraced farms, suddenly transformed into a fortress. Once known for its quiet fields of sugarcane and its slow, coastal winds, it now held a far darker distinction: the final defensive wall before the Japanese home islands. To Tokyo's high command, Okinawa was not just soil. It was the last shield, the last chance to bleed the American advance before it reached the mainland. Officers repeated the phrase endlessly: the island must be defended at all costs. But beneath that military resolve lived 300,000 civilians, families who had never left the island, now trapped between two approaching forces. They had watched, month after month, as thousands of Japanese soldiers dug into their hillsides, carving tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions beneath their homes. Entire mountains became underground fortresses. Schools became supply depots. Sacred caves became command posts. And all the while, the people of Okinawa were told that the coming enemy would show no mercy. Propaganda had taken root long before the first American ship appeared on the horizon. Flyers, military instructors, and local officials repeated the same nightmare visions. The Americans would kill prisoners, torture civilians, and enslave survivors. Many believed it. Others wanted not to believe, but fear is a powerful persuader. And in the darkness of crowded shelters and earthen caves, rumors grew louder than truth. Diaries from those months paint the psychological landscape with painful clarity. One mother wrote that she slept with her children fully clothed, convinced they would need to run at any moment. A teenage boy recorded hearing distant artillery practice and wondering whether he would live long enough to see the next sunrise. Another entry, written by a local schoolteacher, simply asked, "When the battle begins, will there be a place left on this island where one can hide?" Beyond the coastline, the world was already closing in. Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, was preparing to strike. By late March, nearly 1,300 American ships, carrying 180,000 soldiers and Marines, had converged on Okinawa. It was an armada unlike anything Asia had ever seen. And then, on a quiet Sunday morning, the sea turned black with ships. As the spring of 1945 tightened its grip on Okinawa, the island's civilians found themselves trapped in a narrowing corridor between two advancing fears. Behind them stood the Imperial Japanese Army, digging deeper into the island's limestone hills. Ahead of them loomed the overwhelming firepower of the United States, drawing closer with each passing tide. For the people who had lived their entire lives on this isolated chain of islands, there was no escape route, no neutral ground, and increasingly, no sense of safety at all. Japanese troops entrenched themselves everywhere civilians once lived. Caves beneath family homes were carved into interconnected bunker systems. Tunnels pushed through farmland. Machine gun nests were built behind village courtyards. Soldiers ordered families to abandon their homes and move into foothills or ravines, where air, water, and food were scarce. Survivor accounts describe soldiers seizing cooking pots, taking stored rice, even pulling tools from the hands of farmers who had used them since childhood. Young boys, some barely in their teens, were taken as porters, forced to carry ammunition and supplies into dark, airless tunnels. Many civilians later recalled a painful truth: they feared their own army more than the Americans they had never met. Japanese officers enforced the doctrine of absolute resistance. No civilian was to be captured alive. To surrender was considered an unforgivable betrayal, both of the emperor and of one's own family. Whole groups of villagers were instructed to keep grenades close at hand. Some were given two, one for the enemy, and one for themselves if capture became imminent. The message was uncompromising. Death was honorable. Survival under American control was not. Meanwhile, the sea that surrounded Okinawa no longer brought fishermen home. It brought bombardment. In the days leading up to the American landing, U.S. naval forces unleashed one of the heaviest shore bombardments of the Pacific War. More than 500,000 shells rained onto the island, a relentless percussion that shook earth, stone, and every shelter civilians had tried to hide within. One survivor recalled that the ground seemed to breathe, lifting and falling with each distant explosion. And then the moment everyone had feared or hoped finally arrived. On April 1, 1945, American troops came ashore in immense force. As landing craft grounded themselves on the beaches, civilians across the island retreated deeper underground, clinging to family members, holding their breath, waiting to learn which fear would reach them first. By late April 1945, life for Okinawa civilians had been reduced to a subterranean nightmare. Families huddled in limestone caves carved deep into the island's hillsides, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their world illuminated only by flickering lanterns or slivers of daylight filtering through narrow entrances. Weeks passed without adequate water, and food was rationed to the barest scraps. Infants cried in hunger, and in the oppressive heat and stench, some suffocated, their mothers powerless but for the instinct to shield them from discovery. Silence became a weapon of survival. Mothers muffled newborns, older children learned to whisper, and every cough or scrape of a rock against a foot could mean death. In those caves, ordinary life collapsed. Schooling, farming, market days, all were swallowed by the fear that each step, each breath could invite artillery fire, strafing planes, or the accusation of betrayal. Diaries and post-war testimonies describe the psychological strain in stark terms. Fear intertwined with despair, exhaustion mixed with vigilance, every heartbeat a negotiation with survival. Then, the first cautious encounters with American troops began. Soldiers advanced slowly, methodically clearing pockets of Japanese resistance. For civilians who had been told that every American was a butcher, the experience was startling. Soldiers offered water, shared rations, and tended to the wounded. One account recalls a Marine carefully removing a splinter from a boy's hand, an act so unanticipated it challenged every narrative they had been told. The contrast was immediate and jarring. The enemy they had feared with every fiber of their being was, in many cases, a lifeline. But the Japanese military response to these acts was merciless. Officers denounced civilians who accepted aid as traitors to the emperor. Entire families were threatened if they engaged with the Americans. And yet, the realities of starvation and thirst left no choice. Amid the chaos, the tragic phenomenon of group suicides emerged. In some villages, fearing capture or shame, groups of civilians took their own lives using grenades or other means. The scale and horror of these events were a direct product of coercion, indoctrination, and desperation, a testament to the psychological torment inflicted long before the first shell landed. As Japanese command began to crumble under relentless U.S. assault, a new terror took hold. Rumors spread that the Americans would offer no mercy, that every encounter would be deadly. Civilians, already hollowed by weeks underground, now faced an uncertain world above, unsure whether the next sound outside the cave was salvation or annihilation. By June 1945, after more than 80 relentless days of combat, the Imperial Japanese 32nd Army, once considered an unbreakable bastion, finally began to crumble. Okinawa, the last fortress before the Japanese mainland, was no longer a shield. It was a battlefield strewn with the evidence of failure, exhaustion, and despair. Trenches that had been meticulously dug, caves that had harbored soldiers and civilians alike, and fortified hills that had repelled countless assaults were now littered with abandoned equipment, burnt documents, and the silent traces of hurried retreats. Civilians who had survived months underground emerged to witness scenes that defied their deepest indoctrinations. Japanese soldiers fled positions they had once defended with fanatic devotion, leaving behind artillery, rifles, and supplies. In the cliffs above the southern beaches, eyewitnesses reported the haunting sound of explosions as wounded officers chose death over capture, their bodies detonating grenades in a final act of obedience. The island itself seemed to tremble under the weight of despair and surrender. For the ordinary people of Okinawa, the collapse of the 32nd Army shattered decades of ingrained belief. The emperor's forces, taught to be invincible, could now be seen fleeing, broken and disordered. Psychological shock rippled through the population. Letters recovered from young women serving in the Haimuri and Kirin nursing and auxiliary units reveal the internalized pressure to die beautifully in service of the nation. These words, once whispered in the claustrophobic darkness of shelters and tunnels, now echoed with bitter irony as the soldiers they had supported fell apart around them. Civilians began to speak openly for the first time in months. Fearful whispers turned to urgent conversations. "The war is lost," some admitted. "Our leaders lied to us." The veneer of unwavering loyalty cracked under the harsh light of reality. Families who had hidden, starved, and endured for months could finally see that survival was not shame, but necessity. Yet survival came with its own weight. The ruins of their homes, the bodies scattered across once familiar landscapes, and the trauma of witnessing fanaticism dissolve in real time. And then the ultimate symbol of Okinawa's fall. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, the island's commanding officer, committed ritual suicide on June 22, 1945. With his death, the island that had been a fortress of fear and resistance fell utterly silent. For civilians, it was a moment both terrifying and liberating. The collapse of the Imperial Line had ended the war on Okinawa, but the human cost and the psychological scars would echo long after the guns had gone quiet. As the echoes of artillery faded across Okinawa in late June 1945, the island's hills and villages were left scarred but still standing. U.S. soldiers moved carefully through the battered towns, methodically securing what remained of civilian life. Refugee camps were established near former schools, temples, and village squares, improvised shelters that would provide water, medical care, and food to tens of thousands of survivors. Thousands of rations were distributed each day. Tins of corned beef, canned fruit, and chocolate, the latter eliciting bewildered laughter from children who had long forgotten what sweets tasted like. For the civilians who had spent months hiding underground, the presence of the Americans was almost impossible to reconcile with the fears they had carried for so long. Diaries, interviews, and occupation archives from 1945-46 recount the same astonishment. "We expected monsters. Instead, they gave us chocolate." Mothers who had muffled their children's cries in limestone caves now held them openly, marveling at the simplest gestures of care. Soldiers treated minor wounds, carried the elderly, and reassured frightened families in gestures that contradicted every warning the Japanese military had drilled into them. Yet relief was interwoven with grief. Survivors discovered the fates of neighbors and relatives who had vanished during the battle, buried in rubble, lost in the chaos of mass suicides, or killed by indiscriminate shelling. One teenage girl in the occupation archives noted, "I was relieved to be alive, but ashamed that I had survived when my friends did not." These words, repeated across villages, speak to a collective trauma that went beyond physical survival, a psychological reckoning that took root in the first weeks of American occupation. For many, the realization was profound. Surrender had always been possible despite what they had been taught. Decades of propaganda drilled into the civilian population through posters, school lessons, and public speeches had painted the Americans as merciless executioners. Civilians admitted, often for the first time, that they had been deceived. Japan said Americans would kill us. We believed it. And now, we see the truth. As survivors emerged from the caves, from the hills, and from the shattered villages, they faced a revelation more enduring than the scars of war. The greatest enemy they had faced was not the bullets, shells, or grenades that had torn through their island. It was the fear itself. Fear, cultivated over decades, had dictated their every action, shaped every thought, and left wounds that could not be counted in bodies alone. And in the quiet aftermath, amid the ration lines, makeshift hospitals, and cautiously rekindled human voices, Okinawa began the slow, painful journey toward understanding that survival was possible, and that the human spirit could endure even the darkest months of war. Okinawa emerged from World War II scarred in ways that went far beyond the physical destruction of its towns and landscapes. By the time the fighting ended in June 1945, an estimated 150,000 civilians, nearly half of the island's population, had perished. Entire families were erased, villages flattened, and sacred sites reduced to rubble. The survivors carried wounds that were invisible yet profound, trauma etched into memory, fear seared into generations, and grief so vast it could not be fully recorded. In the decades following the war, these survivors became the living testimony of Okinawa's ordeal. Their words, preserved in diaries, oral histories, and interviews, challenged the official narratives that had once glorified sacrifice and unwavering loyalty. Stories of hiding in caves, witnessing the collapse of the 32nd Army, and receiving aid from the Americans, the very enemy they had been taught to fear, reshaped Japanese memory and national identity. For many, the island became both a cautionary tale and a repository of moral reflection, illustrating the consequences of blind militarism and the human cost of ideological obedience. Okinawa's post-war relationship with the United States reflected these complex layers. American bases were established across the island, bringing both economic resources and ongoing tension. Reconstruction efforts transformed towns and infrastructure, but the psychological scars of war lingered. Civilians spoke openly about their experience, using their testimony to educate subsequent generations. Peace museums, annual memorial services, and school history programs now carry these narratives forward, ensuring that the lessons of survival, fear, and humanity are not forgotten. The moral paradox of Okinawa endures. The same propaganda that instilled terror also created acts of extraordinary endurance. The militarism that demanded death also forced unimaginable choices of survival. The fear that had controlled civilians' lives ultimately revealed a stark truth about humanity itself. These voices, once silenced by cave walls and gunfire, now serve as a reminder that the reality of war extends beyond strategy, beyond victories or defeats, into the intimate spaces of ordinary lives caught in extraordinary circumstances. Okinawa's collapse was not merely a tactical defeat for Japan. It foreshadowed the inevitable surrender, illustrating the devastating reach of total war. And in its aftermath, the words of those who survived formed the quiet testimony that history could not ignore. The voices of Okinawa remind us that in war, the quietest words often carry the harshest truths, and they echo long after the guns fall silent.